If you farmed the prairies in the 1970s, there's a fair chance the biggest machine in your yard was a versatile, red and yellow, bought for half the price of a Deere, simple enough to fix yourself with a wrench and a Saturday. Behind that tractor was a company on a Winnipeg side street that held close to 70% of the four-wheel drive market in North America, outselling John Deere, International Harvester, and Case on their own continent. It survived the experts who swore no one would buy it, survived the giants when they finally came for the market, survived the worst farm depression in living memory. And then, after building the biggest tractor the world had ever seen, it quietly stopped being Canadian. How does a company that beat all of them simply lose itself? What happened on Clarence Avenue? Chapter 1. The tractor he promised his father. In 1935, on a farm outside Kenora, Saskatchewan, a 24-year-old named Peter Pakosh made his father a promise. He was leaving the land, leaving the steam threshing rig he'd been running since he was 15, leaving the second oldest place in a household of 12 children. His father, Emil, had come to the prairies from Poland to break sod that had never seen a plow, and he'd raised his boy to the rhythm of a farm that asked everything and gave back only what the weather allowed. He understood, though, what his son actually wanted. It wasn't the land. It was the machines that worked the land. The iron, the gears, the logic of a thing built to do a job. And so Emil did something that must have cost him more than he ever let on. He found a cattle buyer heading east to Winnipeg, and he paid the man $5 to take his son along. $5. To send a farm boy off to the city to study mechanical engineering, because there was no other way to get him there, and no money to spare on a fare. Before he went, Peter told his father he'd be back. Not to farm, they both knew that much. He told him something else instead. He told him that one day he would build him a tractor. It's the kind of thing a young man says. A debt promised, the way sons promise things to fathers they're leaving behind. But Peter Pakosh was not a young man who forgot his debts. It would take him about 30 years to make good on it, and the machine he finally built would not be a modest thing, not a gesture, not a token. It would be a tractor that helped humble the largest farm equipment companies on earth, on their own ground, in their own market. It would carry the pride of an entire region on its drawbar. And in the family's telling, the very first of them, the D100 in 1966, was the tractor Peter built for his dad. This is the story of that promise, and of the empire it grew into on a side street in South Winnipeg. It's the story of a machine that beat John Deere and International Harvester and Case where it mattered most. Not in an advertisement, not in a boardroom, but in the field, on the farm, in the eyes of the men who actually bought and worked the things. And it's the story of how that machine, that company, that piece of prairie invention, stopped being Canadian. Not all at once, not in a single closure, because, and this is what sets Versatile apart from almost every other story in this series, the plant never closed. It's still there. It still builds tractors today. What was lost wasn't the factory. It was who owned it. And the losing began, quietly, in the same year the company built the biggest tractor the world had ever seen. But that's the end. We start with the boy who left. Peter Pakosh was born on that Saskatchewan farm in 1911, one of the dozen children of Emil and Claudia, immigrants who had spelled the family name Pakosh before the prairies smoothed it down into Pakosh. He was a mechanic before he was anything else. By 15, he was running the family's steam threshing outfit, coaxing a temperamental Buhler through the panic of harvest, learning the thing that would define his whole life, that a machine which broke down in a field a long way from anywhere had to be a machine a man could fix himself. The Canada he grew up in was still trying to become an industrial country. For half a century, a wall of protective tariffs, the old national policy, had shielded whatever manufacturing the young Dominion could build, coaxing factories into being behind a barrier that kept cheaper foreign goods out. It was nation-building through iron and duty rates, and it was the environment that made a domestic farm machinery industry possible in the first place. Massey Harris, out of Toronto, had grown fat and famous inside that wall. Its red machines sold from Manitoba to Argentina. So, when Peter Pakosh went to Winnipeg on a cattle buyer's charity, and then, around 1940, went further east to Toronto, and took a job at Massey Harris, it should have been the summit of a farm boy's ambition. He married a young woman named Adeline in the years just before the war. He took a draftsman's stool in the design offices of the biggest name in the business. It wasn't the summit. It was the beginning of an insult that would build an empire. Chapter 2. The Auger Massey. Threw away at Massey Harris, Peter Pakosh had an idea, and the idea came straight off the farm. Grain augers, the long screw conveyors that lift harvested grain up into a bin or the back of a truck, were slow, heavy, brutal things in those days. A man could hurt himself moving one. Pakosh, who had actually shoveled and lifted and moved grain with his own body, saw exactly how to make one better. Lighter. Simpler. Something one farmer could set up and run alone, without a second pair of hands he might not have. He worked the whole thing out on paper and carried it to the company that employed him. Massey Harris looked at the drawings and said no. The design, they told him, wasn't feasible. And when he asked to be moved out of drafting and into product design, where he might actually build the things he could see so clearly in his head, they refused him that too. A draftsman was a draftsman. He would stay at his stool. So Peter Pakosh built the auger himself. On his own time, with his own hands and his own money, he made prototypes in Toronto and sold them to farmers he still knew back home in Saskatchewan. The neighbors, the men his father's age, the ones who would trust a Kenora boy over a factory catalog. The augers worked. Word traveled the way it travels on the prairies, over the fence and at the elevator, and more farmers wanted them. And Pakosh took the money from each sale and poured it straight back into building the next one, the way a careful farmer plants back his best seed against next year. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it's the seed of everything. The single most important company in Canadian farm machinery, his own employer, the firm whose name was stamped on tractors on 4 continents, had handed a good idea back across the desk and told him it couldn't be done. That discarded auger became the founding capital of a company that would one day outsell Massey on the very prairies where Massey had made its fortune. The giant's cast-off became the underdog's first brick. He didn't do it alone. He had a brother-in-law, and the two of them together made a whole that neither could have been apart. Roy Robinson was a farm-raised machinist from Grand Valley, Ontario, and in 1942 he married Peter's sister, Rose. Where Pakosh was the quiet engineer, devout, exact, a lifelong Jehovah's Witness who kept his own counsel and his ideas close, Robinson was the other kind of prairie man entirely. He stood 6'4". He wore cowboy boots and a Stetson. He filled a doorway and dominated a room, and when he ran a shop floor, every man on it knew who was in charge. He was the front of the house. Pakosh was the mind behind it. The two men sealed their partnership the way prairie men did, with a handshake, no lawyers, no fine print. In 1947, they gave it a name, the Hydraulic Engineering Company, run out of the Toronto area. The first product beyond the augers, a field sprayer, had been assembled the year before in the basement of Pakosh's own house, an empire's first machine, built where the furnace was. Robinson became the firm's first paid employee at $7 a week. $7 a week for a man who would one day be the company's president. That division of labor held for the rest of the company's independent life. Pakosh generated the ideas. Robinson ran the operation. And there's one detail the family kept that tells you everything about how Peter Pakosh's mind worked. He carried a piece of chalk in the pocket of his 3-piece suit, so that whenever a design arrived while he was walking the floor, he could kneel down and sketch it directly onto the concrete, right there, in front of the men who would build it, a man in a good suit, down on his knees on the shop floor, drawing the next machine in chalk before it faded under 100 pairs of boots. That was the engine of the whole enterprise. By the early 1950s, they'd made the decision that would shape everything to come. They moved west, to West Kildonan, in Winnipeg, to sit at the edge of the market that mattered most. The Prairie farm was scaling up. The quarter-section homestead was giving way to the 1,000-acre operation, and then to something bigger still. And bigger operations needed bigger, faster, simpler machines than anyone was building for them. Winnipeg sat at the eastern gate of all that wheat, a rail hub with the whole grain west spread out behind it. There, they added the machine that first made their name across the prairies. A self-propelled swather, the Model 103, with a steering wheel design so obviously right that competitors copied it almost as fast as it appeared. It was a small revolution in its own quiet way. A swather, a single operator could steer with the ease of driving a car, cutting and windrowing a crop in one pass. And it sold, and it sold, and it kept selling. The little company outgrew West Kildonan the way a boy outgrows a coat. In 1963, they incorporated as Versatile Manufacturing Limited and offered shares to the public. And in 1964, they opened a new factory at 1260 Clarence Avenue in the Fort Garry district of South Winnipeg, a plant that became, almost overnight, the largest swather factory in the world. In its first year alone, that one plant built 5,000 swathers. 5,000 from a company that a handful of years earlier had been a basement, a handshake, and a stack of hand-built augers. There was a piece of luck buried in the geography too, and it was the kind of luck that would look very different decades later. Since 1944, a special Canada-United States arrangement had let farm machinery cross the border duty-free, a free trade corridor for tractors and implements that existed long before the great trade agreements of the 1980s. It meant a factory in Winnipeg could serve not just the Canadian Prairies, but the entire American plains, shipping south without a tariff to slow it. The open border was Versatile's great advantage. One day, that same open border would become the knife held to the plant's throat. But that was a long way off. The formula, in the family's own plain words, was almost stubborn in its simplicity. Build basic machines that did the job well, at a reasonable price, roughly half what a competitor charged. It wasn't glamorous. It was Prairie common sense turned into a business plan. And it was about to be tested by the biggest gamble the two men ever made. Chapter 3. The idea the experts called stupid. By the mid-1960s, Versatile was doing well. Swathers, augers, sprayers, good, honest machines selling steadily to grateful farmers. The company could have stayed exactly there and prospered. It should have, according to the people they paid to tell them what to do. Because when Prakash and Robinson began talking about building a big, heavy, four-wheel drive tractor, an articulated machine that bent in the middle, with power driving all four of its enormous wheels, the men with the clipboards told them not to. A consulting firm studied it and said no. A marketing firm looked at the same question and reached the same answer. There was no market for such a thing, they said. No farmer would spend money on a big, heavy, ungainly machine like that. It was too much tractor for a business that ran on caution and thin margins and a deep suspicion of anything new. The professionals had run the numbers, and the numbers said, don't. Prakash and Robinson listened to all of it, and then they did it anyway. Their reasoning wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was farm logic, worked out by two men who had spent their lives behind machines in real fields. Four-wheel drive meant a farmer could pull a bigger implement, faster, without the front end rearing up or the rear wheels digging themselves into holes. Big flotation tires spread the weight and meant getting onto soft spring ground days earlier than a conventional tractor dared. And on the prairies, where the growing season is short and the weather is a gambler who never blinks, a few extra days of seeding can be the whole difference between a good year and a ruined one. And 15 years of building simple, cheap, field-repairable machines meant Versatile could make one of these giants and sell it at a price that would make the Americans rub their eyes. A point of precision here, because the people who love these machines will hold you to every word of it. Versatile did not invent the articulated four-wheel drive tractor. A company called Steiger had built the first one years earlier, famously in a barn in North Dakota. What Versatile did, what no one else had managed, was work out how to mass-produce one affordably for the ordinary large acreage farmer instead of the wealthy few who could commission a custom giant. Steiger built the first. Versatile built the first that a prairie wheat farmer could actually walk into a dealership and sign for. In a story like this one, that distinction is the whole ballgame. The first two came in 1966. The D100 ran a Ford six-cylinder diesel, 100 horsepower. The G100 ran a Chrysler V8 on gasoline. No cab, A man drove them out in the weather, the way he always had. No frills. And priced under $10,000, roughly half what the competition asked for anything that could do comparable work. And here is one of the quiet ironies threaded all the way through this company's life. Versatile's tractors were powered by its rivals and suppliers' own engines. Ford, Chrysler, later, Cummins. The industrial giants literally sold Versatile the beating hearts of the very machines that would go out into the field and take their customers. Every D100 that outworked a Deere did it on an engine bought from Detroit. That first year, the trickle was thin. Only about 100 of the D100s and around 25 of the G100s, a late arrival into the model year. But the farmers who bought them talked. They talked at the elevator and the coffee counter and over the fence line, and their neighbors listened, and their neighbors came looking. The experts had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely, expensively wrong. There was a market. It had simply been waiting for someone reckless enough, or clear-eyed enough, to build the machine at a price a working farmer could sign for. After that, the expansion came in a rush. In 1967, 3 more models arrived: the D118, the 125, the 145. And Versatile bolted 127,000 square feet onto the Clarence Avenue plant just to keep the line moving. In 1972, the company broke the 200 horsepower barrier with the 700. Then came the Series 2 machines, the 700, the 800, the 850, the 900. Cummins power now, 220 horsepower climbing toward 300, and behind them, the 750 and 825 and 950. The catalog thickened. The horsepower climbed. The dealers multiplied across the plains. There was a reckoning waiting inside all that success, though, and it was the oldest reckoning in business. Versatile had proved the four-wheel drive market existed, and the moment it did, the giants who had ignored the segment came for it. John Deere brought out its own articulated machines. International Harvester followed. Steiger, the pioneer, pushed harder. Case pressed in. Suddenly, the little Winnipeg company that had been laughed off by the consultants was defending a market it had opened against competitors with 100 times its resources and dealer networks that blanketed the continent. Versatile held them off with the only weapons it had ever needed: price and simplicity, and the plain fact that its machines were built to be fixed in a farmyard rather than shipped back to a dealer. A Deere might have the badge and the financing and the paint, but a Versatile did the same work for less money and broke down less often. And when it did break, a farmer could get under it himself with a wrench and a Saturday. Out where it counted, in the fields, in the yards, at the elevators where farmers compared notes, that was enough. The giants took a share. They never took the lead. Not while the company stayed itself. And somewhere in those years, without any single day you could circle on a calendar, Versatile stopped being the plucky Winnipeg upstart that the consultants had warned off, and became the thing itself. The name a prairie farmer reached for first. The machine parked in the yard that told every neighbor exactly what kind of operation this was. The promise to Emile Pacoche had been kept, and then some. And it was about to grow into something that neither man standing in that Saskatchewan farmyard in 1935 could ever have imagined. Chapter 4. 70% of the prairies. Come inside the plant at 1260 Clarence Avenue in the middle of the 1970s, because this is the part of the story the people who were there still talk about. Not in statistics, but with a kind of ache in the voice. Picture arriving for the morning shift in January, when a Winnipeg cold snap can settle in at 30 below and sit there for a week without apology. The block heaters are plugged in down the whole length of the parking lot, 100 engines ticking, exhaust hanging in air too still and too cold to carry it away. You come in through the doors, and the temperature swings 20, 30, 40 degrees in a single step, and the noise rises up to meet you all at once. The ring of steel on steel, the hiss and thump of hydraulics, the deep continuous hum of a big plant running flat out. Overhead cranes carry axle housings the size of small cars down the length of the building. On the line, the great articulated frames take shape, bending at the center pivot that let these machines crab and turn where a rigid tractor would only bury its nose in spin. The workforce that built them was Winnipeg to the bone. The city had one of the deepest and most varied industrial labor pools in the country. Ukrainian and Polish and Eastern European families who had settled the North End across generations. Men whose fathers had worked the railway shops and the garment trade and the foundries before them. That heritage runs strong through Winnipeg's working class, and it ran through the versatile floor in the accents at the lunch table and the names on the time cards. In time, the plant would be organized under the Canadian Auto Workers, Local 2224, a union whose fate would matter enormously to the end of this story. Though nobody bolting frames together in 1975 was thinking about endings, out behind the plant sat something most factories never had. 40 acres of test ground, with a paved quarter-mile circuit and a bump track, where every design could be run and worked and deliberately broken and run again before it ever reached a farmer's yard. Because that was the entire philosophy, made physical. These machines had to survive alone, out in a field a long way from any dealer, in conditions that would shake a lesser tractor apart. Versatile built them to be repaired by the man who owned them, with the tools already hanging in his shop. Simple, rugged, cheap to run and cheaper to fix. The Prairie virtues, cast in iron and painted a red and yellow you could pick out across 2 full sections of stubble. There was pride on that floor of a particular kind. A man who spent his shift bolting together a machine knew exactly where it was going and exactly what it would do. That a farmer 300 miles west would climb into it come spring and outwork a tractor that cost twice as much and wore a famous American badge. The whistle marked the shifts. Friday brought the paycheck. And the thing you built with your hands on Thursday might be pulling a 40-foot cultivator across a Saskatchewan section by the time the ground thawed. That was work a man could measure, work he could see. And the farmers noticed something else, something that never showed up on a spec sheet, but ran underneath everything. This was a Western Canadian company, not a branch plant taking its orders from Detroit, not a central Canadian giant headquartered in Toronto or Hamilton, treating the West as a distant market to be served and forgotten. This was a Winnipeg firm, run by a Saskatchewan farm boy and an Ontario machinist, building machines for the people who lived where they lived and farmed the same short seasons. In a West that has always felt a little like somebody else's hinterland, its wealth pulled east, its decisions made in rooms it was never invited into, Versatile was one of its own. That counted for more than any brochure could ever say. The numbers, when they came, were almost hard to credit. Through the 1970s, Versatile is reported to have held something like 70% of the entire North American four-wheel drive tractor market. 70%. A single Winnipeg company, outselling John Deere and International Harvester, and Case and Massey Ferguson, all of them together. In the segment it had been told, in writing, by paid professionals, did not exist. That figure is industry lore as much as audited fact, repeated for decades by farmers and historians and the halls of fame. But even discounted, even hedged with every caution, it points squarely at a truth. In that machine, on those prairies, Versatile simply won. They didn't stop at the border either. In 1979, Versatile signed a deal with Fiat to supply the European market, where its tractors rolled out in Fiat orange, badged as the Fiat 44 series. A Winnipeg machine wearing an Italian color, working the fields of Italy and France. The very biggest models were aimed at the vast single-block farms of Australia, where a tractor could run in a straight line for the better part of a day. The Prairie underdog had gone global, and it never stopped inventing. The most quietly brilliant idea of all came from Peter's own brother, Daniel Pakosh, the bidirectional tractor. The operator's station swiveled, so the whole machine could work in either direction. The driver simply turned his seat to face the other way, and what had been the back of the tractor became the front. For loader work, for swather duty, for a dozen everyday jobs where a farmer wasted half his time craning his neck and backing up, it was a genuine transformation. The Versatile 150. Bidirectional, in 1977, is billed as the first bidirectional tractor in the world. A real Canadian first, dreamed up in Winnipeg. It was such a good idea that it would outlive the company's independence entirely. surviving under later owners and other flags long after the men who conceived it had lost the right to call it theirs. But in the summer of 1977, none of that shadow had fallen yet. The order books were full. The line was full. Out on the test track, something enormous was taking shape. The biggest tractor anyone on Earth had ever attempted. And the two men who had started all of it with a handshake and a basement sprayer stood at the very top of the mountain they'd built. They just didn't know it was the top. Buyout, Chapter 5. Big Roy and the Vancouver Handshake. They called it Big Roy. It was named for Roy Robinson, the 6'4" president in the cowboy boots and the Stetson, because it was Robinson himself who, as head of the company, ordered the thing built. Officially, on paper, it was the versatile 1080. Nobody ever called it that. It was Big Roy from the day it rolled, and Big Roy it has stayed. The machine had 4 axles and 8 enormous wheels. In the middle of it sat the operator's cab, and behind the cab, mounted at the very rear, a Cummins engine displacing 1,150 cubic inches and producing 600 horsepower, at a time when a big, serious farm tractor might have managed half that. Fueled and ready, Big Roy weighed something close to 27 tons. It was so long, and the cab so hemmed in by iron front and back, that the driver couldn't actually see the drawbar behind him. So Versatile mounted a closed-circuit television camera and gave him a monitor to watch it. A television camera, on a farm tractor, in 1977, just so a man could see what he was hitching to. That was Big Roy. It was Versatile's entry in a strange and magnificent contest that gripped the industry for a few years. The race to build the single largest tractor in the world. Steiger had its Panther twin, at 650 horsepower. Out in Montana, the builders of Big Bud were assembling a 760 horsepower Colossus. And Winnipeg answered with Big Roy. 8 wheels, a rear-mounted diesel, and a camera to see the hitch. Bragging rights, cast in steel, for a company that had come from nothing and now wanted the whole world to know it. Only one Big Roy was ever built. It was too big and too expensive to actually sell. No farmer needed 27 tons of tractor, however much a man might have wanted to stand beside one and have his picture taken. And it carried a flaw that would have doomed it in the field regardless. With all 4 of its tires on each side running down in a single track, it compacted the soil so severely that it worked against the very ground it was meant to farm, pressing the earth into hardpan under its own colossal weight. It was a glorious, impractical, gloriously overbuilt statement. A company at the absolute zenith of its confidence, standing up and saying to the American giants, "Look what we can do. Look what a Winnipeg outfit can build." And here is the thing about that peak. Here is the fact that sits at the dead center of this entire story. The fact, the simple version, the one about a single fatal buyout years later, can never let you see. In 1977, the same year Versatile built the biggest tractor on Earth, Peter Paykosh and Roy Robinson sold control of the company, not to Ford. That comes later, and it is a different chapter, a different decade, a different set of hands entirely. In 1977, after a proposed merger with the Heston Corporation of Kansas had collapsed 2 years earlier, the founders sold their controlling interest to Cornett Industries, a diversified conglomerate out of Vancouver, a firm whose money came substantially from West Coast shipyards. The following year, Cornett folded itself and Versatile together and took the tractor company's name for the whole thing, becoming Versatile Corporation. So the Prairie Champion, the machine built for a Saskatchewan farmer, was now one division of a Vancouver holding company whose fortunes would rise and fall with the building of ships. Peter Paykosh was 66 years old. He was a devout man with no dynastic plan, no son groomed to inherit an empire, and a company that needed ever more capital to keep scaling into the giant it was becoming. The reasons were human and reasonable, the way these reasons almost always are. But the consequence was permanent, and it was structural. From that year forward, the fate of the machine built for Emil Paykosh would be decided in boardrooms 1,000 miles to the west, and then, in the fullness of time, in boardrooms very much farther away than that. The founders had already cashed out a full decade before the American buyout that everyone remembers as the beginning of the end. The truth is quieter and darker and sadder. The loss of independence did not arrive with a foreign flag and a fanfare and a headline. It arrived in 1977, in the same 12 months that gave the world Big Roy, sealed with the same kind of handshake that had built the whole company in the first place. The highest point and the first crack share a date. Out on the test track that summer, the biggest tractor in the world sat gleaming under the wide Manitoba sky, and the men who had built it stood at the summit of everything they had made from an auger and a basement sprayer and a piece of chalk. You could see for miles from up there. What none of them could see, not Pakosh, not Robinson, not the 1,000-odd workers on the Clarence Avenue floor, was that the ground had already begun to shift beneath them. The farm economy that had carried them all the way up was about to turn hard and turn cruel. And the company, for the first time in its life, was no longer theirs to steer through what was coming. The land was about to stop paying, and Versatile, for the first time, would have to face the storm as somebody else's asset. Chapter 6. When the land stopped paying. For a while, at the very start, it didn't feel like anything had changed. The tractors kept coming off the Clarence Avenue line. In 1977, the same year as Big Roy and the Vancouver sale, Versatile rolled out its Constant Power series. In 1979, it bought Noble, a Canadian tillage equipment maker, and sold its implements under the Versatile Noble name. In 1981, it built the 1150, 470 horsepower, a genuine giant, more machine than almost any farmer would ever need. On paper, the empire was still climbing, but the ground had begun to move. At the very end of 1980, on the 19th of December, the prime interest rate in the United States hit an all-time record, 21.5%, as Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve tried to break the back of inflation with money made suddenly, brutally expensive. The shock crossed the border the way weather crosses the border, without asking. On the prairies, farm borrowing rates ran sometimes north of 17%, and a farm tractor, especially a 400-horsepower one, is not bought with cash out of a coffee can. It is bought on borrowed money, on a note at the bank, against next year's crop. At 17%, next year's crop stopped being enough. You could read the whole crisis in the order book at Clarence Avenue. For 15 years, the dealers had phoned in wanting more machines than the plant could build. Now the phone went quiet, and the ones that did call were asking whether they could hold off on the tractors they'd already ordered. Out on the plains, the farm auctions began. A neighbor's equipment lined up in a muddy yard. A crowd of quiet men who'd come as much to stand with the family as to bid. A 400-horsepower Versatile was the last thing anyone at those auctions was in the market for. And a tractor factory lives or dies on the willingness of a farmer 3 provinces away to sign a note he isn't sure he can pay. That willingness had evaporated, all across the West, in the space of about a year. The rest arrived from every direction at once. In 1980, the United States placed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, and Prairie grain prices felt the blow. Farmland values, which had climbed steadily for a decade, began to slide, and then to fall. Farm incomes collapsed, and a farmer staring down 17% interest and a bin full of grain he couldn't sell at a decent price does one thing above all others. He does not buy a new tractor. He nurses the old one through another season. He welds the crack himself. He waits. The whole industry went into the fire together. International Harvester, one of the oldest and proudest names in American farm machinery, a company that had helped mechanize a continent, was gutted. Its farm business eventually broken up and sold off. White Farm Equipment collapsed into insolvency, and Massey Ferguson, the great Canadian firm, the one that, 40 years earlier, had handed a young draftsman named Pakosh his auger drawings back across the desk and told him no, Massey itself came within an inch of going under. It was saved only by a rescue of roughly $250 million from the governments of Canada and Ontario in the early 1980s, after which it remade itself into something called Verity Corporation and limped on. The giant that had rejected the auger was now on government life support. The man it had rejected had by then built and sold an empire. Versatile might have weathered all of it. It had weathered downturns before, had ridden out the ordinary cruelty of a farm economy more than once. But Versatile was no longer steering its own ship, and this is where the sale of 1977 turned from a footnote into a fate. Its parent, Versatile Corporation, was a Vancouver conglomerate, and the other half of that conglomerate was shipbuilding. The West Coast yards, folded in and rebranded as Versatile Pacific Shipyards, were themselves bleeding money as the long post-war shipbuilding boom ran dry. The cancellation of a federal icebreaker project, the Polar 8, would eventually drive those shipyards all the way into bankruptcy by 1992. So consider the trap the founders' sale had built, though not one of them ever meant it as a trap. A tractor company was now facing the worst farm equipment depression in living memory, while owned by a parent that was itself hemorrhaging cash on the far side of the country for reasons that had nothing whatever to do with tractors. Two unrelated crises, bolted together by a single share transfer, each one dragging the other down. The man running Versatile Manufacturing through these years was Paul Soubry, who had become president in 1977, that same pivotal year, and who would hold the post all the way through to 1995, across every owner that was coming. He inherited a champion and a catastrophe in the same handshake. He would spend nearly 2 decades steering a company that answered more and more to people who had never set foot on the Clarence Avenue floor. The simple story says the founders' financial troubles forced the sale to Ford. But Pakosh and Robinson were largely gone by then, their names on a share transfer already a decade old. The distress that would finally push Versatile into American hands did not belong to two Prairie founders at all. It belonged to a Vancouver holding company drowning in the wrong ocean. The independence was already lost. Now the flag itself was about to change. Chapter 7. Painted Ford Blue. In 1985, in Michigan, Ford made a decision that would reach all the way to a factory in Winnipeg. Ford Motor Company had decided it wanted to be a full-line farm equipment maker, not just a tractor company, but a firm that could sell a farmer everything he needed, from the baler to the combine to the plow. So it bought Sperry New Holland from the Sperry Corporation, a deal reported at around $330 million American dollars plus assumed liabilities, and formed Ford New Holland with its headquarters in New Holland, Pennsylvania. Now Ford had hay tools. It had balers, combines, small and mid-sized tractors. It had almost the whole range. What it did not have was a big articulated four-wheel drive tractor, the one machine Versatile had built its entire reputation on. And the gap became suddenly, painfully urgent in 1986, when Case International reached out and swallowed Steiger, Versatile's oldest rival in the four-wheel drive game. In a single stroke, Ford's competition had the high horsepower machines, and Ford had a hole in its lineup exactly the shape of Winnipeg. Versatile plugged the hole. The deal was struck in 1986 or 1987. The records don't entirely agree, and enthusiasts have argued the point across kitchen tables and internet forums for years since, and Ford-branded tractors began coming off the Clarence Avenue line by 1988. What Ford actually paid for Versatile has never been made public. It isn't in the filings. It likely survives only in a family history and in the print archives of the Winnipeg Free Press. So here is a strange and telling fact. The price of the single buyout that everyone remembers as the fatal one, the sale that supposedly destroyed the company, is a number nobody today can name. There's another shadow over these years. The depressed farm market had hit Versatile hard enough that several accounts hold the tractor business had actually stopped production before Ford took it over, with the Ford-badged machines resuming the line only afterward. Whether that ever amounted to a formal insolvency isn't clear from the surviving record, and it's fairer to call it what it plainly was: a company knocked flat on its back by a crisis it had entered without the shield of its own independence. Either way, the American giant arrived in Winnipeg to find its new prize wounded and waiting. And then the erasing began. Gently, almost politely, the way these things always seem to happen. The plant kept running. The workers kept their jobs. Winnipeg kept building four-wheel drive tractors, exactly as it had the year before. Nothing you could photograph had changed, but the machines changed color. The bold, versatile red and yellow and black, the livery a prairie farmer could pick out across two full sections of stubble, the colors that meant something specific and local and proud, gave way to Ford blue and white. The versatile name did not vanish overnight. It would have been cleaner if it had. Instead, it shrank. The decals got smaller. Season by season, they migrated down the machine, below the model number, until the name that had humbled the giants read like a supplier's footnote on somebody else's tractor. The Prairie Champion was quietly becoming a line item in an American catalog. This is the Buyout the simple story blames for everything. And it did matter, enormously. It was the first time in the company's life that the machine built for a Saskatchewan farmer answered to a foreign owner. But it was the third owner, not the first. The independence had gone a decade before, in Vancouver. And this would not be the last flag to fly over Clarence Avenue. Not by a long way, because Ford didn't hold on for long, either. In 1991, Fiat's agricultural arm bought 80% of Ford New Holland, folding it together with Fiat's own farm equipment operations to create a new company, New Holland NV. Fiat would take the remainder within a few years, and though the Ford name was licensed to linger on the tractors until the end of the decade, it was effectively dropped by 1998. Now the machines of Winnipeg belonged in substance to an Italian conglomerate. And here the simple story makes its second mistake, the one worth correcting plainly, because it changes who the villain is supposed to be. Nothing forced the Fiat deal. There was no regulator in the room, no antitrust ruling, no forced sale in 1991. It was simply a transaction between corporations, one owner selling to the next. Winnipeg carried on through it without a tremor. In fact, the plant thrived. A whole new line of tractors, developed under the internal name Project 396, on a famously lean budget of around $30-odd million, went into production on the versatile assembly line in September of 1993. They were called Genesis. They were good machines, well-made and well-regarded, and they kept the Clarence Avenue line humming through the early 1990s. So the plant was busy, modern, productive. It just wasn't Canadian anymore, and it wasn't even called versatile. It was a New Holland facility, building New Holland machines under Italian ownership in the heart of Manitoba. The Prairie Champion reduced to a well-run branch plant with a foreign name over the door. The real reckoning, the one the simple story wrongly pins on Fiat, was still 8 years away. And when it finally came, it would come not from Italy and not from Detroit, but from a courtroom in Washington, D.C. Chapter 8. The Regulators' Verdict. By 1999, two of the biggest names in farm machinery decided to become one, and the decision would reach across an international border to put a Winnipeg factory up for sale. New Holland NV, the Fiat-owned company that now included the Clarence Avenue plant, moved to merge with the Case Corporation of the United States. The Department of Justice described it as New Holland's $4.3 billion acquisition of Case. Counting the debt the combined company would assume, the whole transaction ran to something closer to $6 billion, with Case shareholders paid $55 a share, and the two firms' revenues from the previous year totaling $12 billion between them. Out of the merger would rise CNH Global, one of the largest agricultural equipment companies on the face of the earth. There was just one problem. Its name was Steiger. Case had bought Steiger back in 1986, the very acquisition that had once sent Ford scrambling all the way to Winnipeg for a four-wheel drive machine of its own. And Steiger and Versatile were the two dominant names in the entire North American articulated four-wheel drive market, the two giants of the segment that Versatile had practically invented as a mass business, back when the consultants swore there was no market at all. Put Steiger and Versatile under one corporate roof, and that single roof would command almost the whole field. One company would set the price of nearly every big four-wheel drive tractor a North American farmer could buy. Washington said no. On the 4th of November, 1999, the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice filed suit in the Federal District Court in Washington, alongside a proposed consent decree, the conditions under which the merger would be permitted to go ahead. The Assistant Attorney General, a man named Joel Klein, laid it out in the plainest possible terms. American farmers, he said, use this equipment day in and day out. The merger as proposed would have driven up the price of tractors and hay tools. The divestitures were there to keep competition alive and to protect farmers from paying more. The government put the American farm tractor market at around $1.5 billion a year, and the hay tools market at another $250 million on top of that. And the consent decree named exactly what had to go. New Holland would be required to divest its versatile four-wheel drive line, its Genesis two-wheel drive line, and the Winnipeg plant where both of them were built. There it was, set down in a legal document filed in an American courthouse. The factory on Clarence Avenue, the plant that Pacoche and Robinson had raised out of a swather business, the largest of its kind in the world when it opened, ordered onto the auction block by the government of another country. Not because it had failed, not because its tractors were bad or outdated or unwanted. Precisely the opposite. It was being sold off because its machines were too good and too dominant in a market about to become too concentrated. The company had survived the giants for 30 years by beating them fair and square in the field. Now it was being cut loose because merging two of those giants together would have made the combination unbeatable. And versatile was the piece that had to be sacrificed to keep the game honest. One machine was carved out of the deal by name. The bidirectional, Daniel Pacoche's world-first idea, the swiveling tractor dreamed up in Winnipeg, by then sold as the new Holland TV 140, was kept inside the merged company, and its production was simply moved to another plant somewhere else in the empire. The invention would live on. It just would not live on in Winnipeg, and it would not carry the family's name, and the men who had built it would watch it drive away. So the market concentration instinct buried in the simple story turns out to have been right all along. It was only ever attached to the wrong merger and the wrong rival. It was never Fiat in 1991. It was Case's ownership of Steiger at the CNH merger in 1999. The regulators looked hard at Versatile and Steiger standing side by side, and they decided the Prairie champion was simply too powerful to be allowed to stay where it was. And so the plant was put up for sale once more. And the buyer who stepped forward this time was, of all things, a Manitoban. For one strange, hopeful moment, it looked as though Versatile might finally be coming home. Chapter 9. The Lockout. The buyer was John Buhler. He was a Winnipeg farm equipment man who had built his own company the hard way, starting decades earlier with the purchase of the Standard gas engine works and growing it, deal by deal, into a stable of familiar Prairie brands, Farm King, Allied, Inland. He knew the business, he knew the machines. And in August of 2000, Buhler Industries bought the Versatile plant from New Holland for a reported 15 million American dollars, plus the assumption of a Canadian government loan of around 32 million. On its face, it was the story the Prairies had been waiting more than 20 years to hear. The champion, exiled first to American hands, then to Italian ones, then set adrift by an American court, was being bought back by a local man, a Manitoban, one of our own, at last. It did not go the way the story was supposed to go. The workers' contract expired at the end of September 2000. The plant floor was represented by the Canadian Auto Workers, Local 2224, somewhere around 250 men and women, many of them with decades of service in the building. In November, with no new deal in sight, they went on strike. John Buhler kept the plant running anyway. He brought in replacement workers and built tractors without the union, about 4 machines a day, coming off a line that had once been the pride of the Prairies, assembled now by hands that had never worked it before. Then, in March of 2001, the strikers blinked. Facing a company that would not budge and a plant that was running without them, they voted to end the strike, to come back, to return to work on the floor they knew. And John Buhler locked them out. He wanted rollbacks, deep cuts to benefits, to seniority, to the whole hard-won architecture of a working life, the structure that had told a man where he stood after 20 years and what his loyalty was worth. And again, through it all, he raised the same possibility, that he might simply pick the whole operation up and move it south, across the line, to Fargo, North Dakota. the border that had once been Winnipeg's great advantage. The open, duty-free line that had let a Manitoba plant serve an entire continent since 1944 was now a blade held over the necks of the people who worked there. On the 7th of June, 2001, the Manitoba Labor Board delivered its finding. It ruled that Buhler Versatile had bargained in bad faith and had provoked the strike in the first place, only the third time in 20 years that the board had made such a finding against any employer in the province. This was not hard bargaining, the board said. It was something well past that. The decision spoke of constant threats to close the plant, of bait-and-switch tactics, of proposals that kept shifting like a moving target a man could never quite hit. It described the company, in plain language, as bullying the union. But a ruling is not a job. The settlement, when it finally came, ran to more than $17 million, paid out to the union and its members. And about 93% of the roughly 200 workers, men who had given the best years of their working lives to that floor, took a severance check instead of going back. Packages in the range of $43,000 to $59,000, each one the cash value of a career. In the end, the union voted itself out of existence. The people who had built these tractors chose the check and the door, because the alternative, going back on those terms, under that owner, with the threat of Fargo hanging over every shift, had become something no one could stomach. Brett Reed had given 26 years to the plant. When it was finally over, he said only that they'd got some closure at last. Scott McLaren, from the CAW, called it exactly what it was. A sad, sad story. He didn't think the factory could be saved. And John Buhler, the local man, the one the Prairies had hoped would bring it home, offered his own strange epitaph. 10 years from now, he said, people would totally forget he had ever existed. Here is the bitter arithmetic at the center of it. The American owner had kept the plant and painted it blue. The Italian owner had kept the plant and built the Genesis on its line. It was the Canadian owner, the man from Winnipeg, the neighbor, the one they'd been waiting for, who broke the workforce that had made Versatile what it was. The plant survived. It kept building tractors. That was never in doubt, and it never has been. But something did die on Clarence Avenue in the winter and spring of 2001. It wasn't the factory. It was the Union Hall. It was the last thread of the idea that coming home might mean being treated any better than they'd been treated by strangers a continent away. The machines rolled on. The men who had made them walked out across the parking lot for the last time, checks folded in their pockets, into the particular silence of a Winnipeg spring, the snow going gray at the edges, the wind coming off the flat land, and behind them a plant that would run just fine without them. Chapter 10. A Russian Flag. Over Clarence Avenue, the next flag came from a very long way off. In 2007, a Russian company called Rostselmash, a combine manufacturer out of Rostov-on-Don, controlled by a group of businessmen led by Konstantin Babkin, bought 80% of Buhler Industries. It was an all-cash offer, $7.25 a share, closing at the turn of November for a reported 145 million Canadian dollars. Rostselmash wanted two things it couldn't easily build for itself: a foothold in the booming Russian market for high-horsepower tractors and instant access to Buhler's network of some 200 dealers across North America. The Prairie champion had become a Russian company's key to two continents at once. And then something genuinely unexpected happened. The Russian owners were, by most accounts, good to the tractor. In October of 2008, they did the one thing every previous owner had failed to do. They brought back the name. Versatile, the real name, the Prairie name, the one that had been shrinking down the flank of the machine for 20 years, was restored as the sole brand on the tractors again. And for the first time in a long while, the division was given the things a serious tractor company actually needs to survive: a proper financing plan, a service department, a parts manager, real warranties. The president, Dmitry Lyubimov, and a sales director named Eric Allison spoke like men with ambition. They were playing in the big leagues now, Allison said, and they meant to act like a big league player. For a few years it worked. The name was back on the machines. The line was busy. A tractor built in Winnipeg said versatile on the side of it again, in red, the way it was meant to. Then geopolitics arrived, as it always seems to arrive at Clarence Avenue, from somewhere else entirely, without asking permission. In 2014, after Konstantin Babkin publicly supported Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress and the Member of Parliament James Bezan called on Ottawa to place sanctions on him. None followed. Then, in February of 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Babkin again voiced his support. This time, the company moved quickly to put distance between itself and its principal owner. Babkin resigned from Buhler's board in March. A Canadian, Grant Adolph, stepped into a senior role in the leadership. The company described itself carefully and repeatedly as 97% Russian-owned, yes, but with roots in Canada that reached back to 1932. Canada, for its part, imposed no sanctions on Rosselmash or on its owners. And Export Development Canada, a federal crown corporation, had guaranteed half of a $14 million loan to Buhler just over a year before the invasion, with something like 700 Canadian jobs cited as being at stake. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. A tractor plant in Winnipeg, its workers' livelihoods partly underwritten by the Canadian government itself, majority owned by a man standing up in public to back a war in Europe. That was where the Long Branch Plant Road, begun with a handshake in Vancouver in 1977, had finally led. The Russian chapter ended the way all these chapters end, with another sale to another country. Late in 2023, a Turkish industrial group, Asko Holding, moved in through its tractor subsidiary, Buyout, and bought roughly 97% of Buhler Industries, some 24 million shares, for a total of $60.5 million Canadian dollars. The deal closed at the end of December. The full amalgamation and the delisting from the Toronto Stock Exchange were completed by April of 2025. The chairman, Sami Konukolu, called it the next step in Asko's expansion into North America. Management spoke of investing more than $25 million in upgrades to the Winnipeg plant. The Russian era, whatever else it had been, was formally over. American, Italian, Canadian, Russian, Turkish. 5 owners in a little over 20 years, passing a factory on a quiet side street in Fort Garry from hand to hand across the map of the world, and through every single one of them. This is the thing to hold on to, the thing that makes this story what it is. The plant never stopped. It's still there. 1260. Clarence Avenue, now put at around 780,000 square feet. It remains the only domestic tractor manufacturer in all of Canada. It builds a range of machines from 175 horsepower up past 600, and it assembles Kubota tractors under contract besides. The company's Canadian operations employ something like 800 people in Winnipeg and down at Morden. Tractors still roll off that line the way they have since the 1960s, one of the longest continuous runs of large tractor manufacturing anywhere on the continent, which is exactly why this was never, in the end, a story about a factory that closed. It's a story about a factory that outlived its own country's claim on it. There is one moment near the end of it that is hard to shake. Big Roy, the 27-ton monster, the single prototype, the tractor with a television camera to watch its own drawbar, named for the 6'4" president who ordered it into being, had been given away to the Manitoba Agricultural Museum out in Austin when the company was sold to Ford in the mid-1980s, and the backlot was cleared out. And in the winter of 2015 and 16, the modern Versatile company trucked Big Roy back to the plant where it had been born, restored it by hand to its original colors, and then returned it to the museum. A foreign-owned company, taking the trouble to honor the Canadian machine at the very root of everything it still made. The red and the yellow and the black, brought back to life one more time by owners who had never known the men who chose those colors. The founders did not see most of it. Roy Robinson died in 1988, the same year the first Ford Blue tractors rolled off the line he'd run. Peter Pakosh lived on until the 20th of February, 1999, dying in Freeport, in the Bahamas, at the age of 87, his wife Adeline gone 4 years before him. In his life, he was named among the significant contributors to the mechanization of agriculture on the continent, inducted into halls of fame in his home province, ranked in the same breath as John Deere and Cyrus McCormick, the founders of the very giants the farm boy from Kenora had gone out and beaten. A man once driven to Winnipeg on $5 of another man's charity, remembered at the end, alongside the greatest names his industry ever produced. He had promised his father a tractor. He built an empire instead, one the family could measure, at its height, in more than 1,000 workers on the Clarence Avenue floor, and better than $100 million in sales in a single year. And the tractors are still out there, on the prairies, in the farmyards, the old red and yellow machines that farmers won't sell, that sons keep running long past their reasonable years, that turn up restored and gleaming at the fall fairs with a crowd of quiet men standing around them, hands in pockets, remembering. The name is still on the building on Clarence Avenue. The line still moves. Tractors still roll off it tonight. It just hasn't been Canada's for almost 50 years. Versatile survived every giant it ever faced in the open field. Deere, International Harvester, Case, Massey, Steiger, Big Bud. It met them all, and it beat them all where it counted, on the farm, in the eyes of the men who bought the machines and worked them and trusted their season to them. What it could not survive was the boardroom. It lost its independence, not to a better tractor, but to a chain of buyouts that began the very year it built the biggest machine in the world. The plant on Clarence Avenue is warm tonight. The lights are on. Somewhere inside, an axle housing swings on an overhead crane down the length of the building, and a great frame bends at the center pivot, the way it has for 60 years. The machines still roll. They were just never ours again.